Welcome everybody aboard. Let's get started right now with news you can use. I'm going to start with the basics. Last week, the Fed, we're going to talk about the Fed and recession, and then we'll get into some housing information to be very specific to you guys. Last week, the Fed raised their interest rate again, 75 basis points, 0.75%. And just to give you some background, at the beginning of the year, it was a 0.25%. It's currently at 3.25%. So it's gone up, whatever that is, 700% since they started raising in about a half a year. What that's done is that's driven up the interest rates. A year ago, when we had 0.25% Fed funds rate, we were at 2.5 or 2.6% in terms of mortgage rates. Now we're about 6.5%, now that we're 3.25. Projection is by the end of next year, and the Fed is targeting a rate of around 4.75%. So we're going up, significantly from here, another 30% increase from where we are today, a little bit more actually. And the projection is interest rates, mortgage rates will be 8+%. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news is that we can make a ton of money in this business, even with a high interest rate. I'm going to talk about that in a second. One more thing to talk about with regard to the Fed. Their number one goal is to stop inflation. Their number one tool to do that is raising interest rates. What happens though, and they're aware of this, is it will slow down the housing market. Absolutely, because of this kind of stuff going from 2.6 to 8+%. And it will cause a spike in unemployment. It'll put more people out of work. The theory is less people can buy houses. There's less activity, financial activity. We talked about this last week. The carpenters, the handymen, the foundation layers, all those guys going to run out of work, and they're not going to bring home a paycheck, and they're not going to be able to spend on expensive things, and it will slow down the overall economy. The bigger problem is that the US dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. And right now, the US dollar is near an all-time strength, all-time high compared to other currencies. That's why these other countries are having higher inflationary rates than we are. These things are tied directly. So, now we have an inverted pound versus dollar. It used to be worth $2, now it's worth less than the dollar. And so extra care has to be taken with what the Fed does, because it doesn't affect just this country, it affects the whole world. And, we may end up being in a pretty good position when this thing's all over, but the rest of the world could be in a severe recession, which will ultimately hurt us down the road longer term. So, they've got a lot of masters they've got to serve. Their number one goal is to move this unemployment rate up. It's currently about 3.7. They want to move it up to about 4.5%. They think that'll be enough, along with the slowdown in the housing market, to get that inflation rate back from 8-9% back to what they want to be, which is really under 2, but it'd probably bring it back down in the 4 range, which is probably acceptable. Okay, so that's kind of the downside. Now we're going to talk about affordability and how that affects our specific business. Right now, affordability is the worst that we've had in years. Actually, it's going to put a little chart up here we can take a look at. Right here on the far right, you see 2022, we're approaching 40%. In other words, if somebody makes $100,000 a year, today it's going to cost them about $40,000 to house themselves. That is the highest it's been since 1981. If you look all the way over to the left side, about 1981 was the last time that it got this expensive. And just look back a year ago, it was sub, and even 2 and 3 years ago, it was sub 20%. So it's almost doubled in this short 2-3 year period of time. It's a crazy thing. And people can't afford housing at this point in time. But there are more than one way to skin a cat. Let's talk though about what happens when affordability goes up or goes down and people can't afford to have these things. What we're seeing out there in the market right now, prices are falling, bidding wars are over, sellers' expectations are down. If you talk to sellers today, they're a lot more amenable than they've ever been, at least in my 20+ years in this business. This should add up to a perfect scenario for buyers. The sellers are more motivated. There's more of them coming to the market. They're more flexible, all that kind of stuff, except for the affordability issue. and the high interest rates that we just talked about. And prices are going to continue to drop. Mark Zandi for Moody's has said that even in with no recession, we're going to be looking at 5 to 10% drop in prices overall. With a mild recession, 15%. And the worst case, with a global recession that affects this country, we could be at 25% 25% drop in number of houses sold. We have had now 7 months in a row as of last month where the number of units of houses that sold have dropped. So every month, drop. So there's less sales, but what's happened is there's also less buyers out there. I mean, less sellers out there. There's less property being put on the market. So at the end of the day, if both the numbers of sellers and numbers of buyers come down, you could make an argument that we're not going to see a big price drop, that everything is going to come down in proportion until we get a large supply of either buyers who can afford at this affordability level or sellers who must sell. I don't see a huge thing's going to happen. 6 out of 7 loans that are in existence today in the US are below this current rate of 6.5%. By the end of this year, it's projected that 99% of all loans will be cheaper than probably where we're going to be at the end of this year, is 7+% interest rate, mortgage rate. And so that, that's a problem. People who have a cheap loan, it's a problem and an opportunity. Sellers who have a cheap loan on their house are hesitant to give that up. And so they're pulling that stuff off the market. And what we're running into is there's actually a chunk of buyers out there who can still afford this kind of affordability. Now, there's some things that we can do that can help that as a country. And one of the things we've done is we've opened it back up to investment from outside other countries. For example, we've let the Chinese come back in with their money and that kind of thing. So there's getting to be a little bit of a resurgence of cash buyers out here. People who are coming in with their money from other countries are dealing with a declining currency in their country. And it's, essentially it is a safe haven to put it in dollar denominated assets in the United States, specifically housing. This is the crown jewel that the Fed is trying to protect. Now, I know it sounds unusual, different, odd. It's like reverse logic that you have to hurt your crown jewel in order to sustain it for a long period of time. That's exactly what the Fed's doing. Anyway, as these buyers come in from out of the country, once again, if you got $1 million in China, it's a safer place to buy $1 million worth of housing in the US than to leave it in Chinese currency yuan or something like that. And so we're seeing that happen. We're also seeing a lot of buyers who can get into a house but can't afford the monthly payment. So the affordability itself is a problem, but they have enough down payment, or they can get in under a government program. The government's going to encourage these kinds of things. They're going to ask for people, they're going to try and push for some of these folks to step up and to buy a house. You'll see a lot of advertisements coming out. I think Fannie Freddie will probably do some advertisements. Now's a great time to own a house, blah, blah, blah. You should get involved quickly. And so you're going to see people come out and do that. Now, what are we seeing out in the marketplace? And how do we fix this? Number one, we're seeing a lot of concessions out there. Austin, Texas has got this big run. Buyers are getting $10,000 gift cards to Home Depot. Pay closing costs. You can pick up your buyer's closing costs. That will save them cash up front, will allow them to have a little bit higher mortgage. We can boost the broker fees. We used to do this probably 15, 20 years ago when we were in the same kind of situation. It's where you've got a broker, your typical 6%, 3% for each side, or 2.5%, 3.5%, however they want to do it. But I remember we came up with an idea. We were having a hard time selling houses in the early 2000s. We threw in a TV for the broker. So the broker who gets that, gets it sold for us, the buyer's broker and the buyer themselves will get a free big screen TV or something like that. And that really helped boost our sales. You just have to think creatively. Adjustable rate mortgages are coming back. And that's one of the best ways to fix this whole situation regarding affordability, is get one of these teaser rate mortgages. Now, I know this was the thing that caused, in theory, the thing that caused the Great Recession, the housing recession of 2008-9. But we've got the majority of the owners of houses out there are in a safe loan that's cheap. And so it wouldn't hurt to add a little bit of more risk to the marketplace by throwing out some adjustable rate mortgages just to keep the engine going. And just to give you that, for those of you who aren't familiar with what those are, there'd be a buy-in at 3 or 4% interest for the first 5 years, and it'll adjust up to some rate based on some index in the loan. And then, of course, there's my favorite, which is an interest rate buy down. You can buy down your buyer's interest rate with their lender by cash. So take that $10,000 gift card that they're giving away in Austin, Texas to buyers and say, I'm going to put this into your loan, and that'll buy your rate from 6.5 here down to 5 or 4.5 or something like that. And that gives them a fixed rate that's lower, not as low as today, but I mean, not as low as it was 6 to 8 months ago, but still low enough that they can afford to get in. And then looking back in history, in the early 80s, they had this problem. They had something very similar. Actually, it was much worse because interest rates got up to 21% for mortgages, 21, 22%. And I run across people all the time. They're like, yeah, I got a mortgage back then on our first house. We first got married, we paid at 21%. And, we had to wait 4 or 5 years and interest rates dropped, we refinanced it. And so that concept is what I call marry the house and date the rate. Marry the house, date the rate. And I think you're going to see this as probably the National Association of Realtors, if they're smart, they will start marketing using this concept. Marry the house. In other words, fall in love with the house today, because houses are short. There's not a lot of sellers. The new house stock is almost ground to a halt because these guys can't build a house as cheap as they can, or when they get done building the house, they've got more into it than they can sell it for. So you're not getting new housing stock. You're not getting a lot of sellers come to the market. So buyers, at some point, that demand keeps building and they know they got to buy. So go ahead and marry the house, fall in love with the house, buy the house now, pay this 6.5%. 2, 3 years from now, the Fed's going to have to drop the rate and you'll be able to get a 4% or less mortgage at that point in time. And so that concept alone, I think, will double the amount of buyers that are going to be willing to jump off the cliff and get into this expensive water of higher priced mortgages. So marry the house, date the rate. That would be my recommendation for the market fixed overall. So anyway, and just one last thing, let me tell you about some of the market prices out there and where they're dropping. They're dropping, of course, most in areas that came up the fastest and got frothy, like California, for example, the West Coast as a whole. So during the month of August alone, San Francisco and Los Angeles each dropped 3.4% in August on the average price of the houses listed. So that comes out to over 40% per year. Now, we won't see a 40% drop, but to see a drop in August is probably unheard of. I'm not even sure if there's any history where that's ever been seen before, where you're actually in the middle of the buying season, which is August, September, October. These are the prime buying months, July to September, October. I have never seen a loss in that month of August. Sacramento, Seattle, Salt Lake City had decreases of 2.5% in August on average. That's over 30% a year. I don't think we're going to see hits that big. I think because everything's coming down in tandem, we're going to see a more stabilized market at some point, even if it's not a balance. In other words, same numbers in and out. But there is definitely cannon fodder here for arguing that the Fed is dramatically hurting the market more than the intended cure. So, I come from the ag industry, and we had an analogy called the dose makes the poison. In other words, you take the right amount of medicine, for example, and you'll be healthier. But if you overdose on that medication, it could kill you. And that's the position the Fed's in today. They're going up, I think, too much, too fast. And it will just cause a boomerang effect or a rubber band snapback effect next year and the year after. We're going to see rates drop a lot. So I would encourage those of you who are selling houses for cash out there to focus on those things: concessions, paying closing costs, boosting the broker compensation or fees, adjustable rate mortgages, encourage those, interest rate buy downs, and then finally, the general concept of marry the house, and date the rate. All right.